Okay, in the last lecture in this module, we're going to discuss some issues of aging and some of the inequalities of aging. Once again, age, while clearly we know that is a progression of life over time, when we think about age in a sociological viewpoint, we realize that our notions of age are largely socially constructed. So when we think about, as we talked about lifespan before, what it is to be a child and what it is to be an adolescent, an adult, and to be elderly are largely to a degree constructions that are cultural. So as I mentioned before in an earlier lecture, adolescence really is a social construction. It doesn't exist other than the fact that we decided that there needed to be this time in the human lifespan where people might be biologically old enough to reproduce and yet not culturally or socially old enough to be a productive member of society. So we kind of stretch childhood out a little bit longer. We've clearly seen that, like I said, with this idea of kind of continuing adulthood or transitional adulthood where adolescents then, even though they're typically considered adults, stay at home longer, prepare more by going to college or gradually accepting the responsibilities of an adult. So along those lines is we can also say that our attitudes about what it is to be elderly or old also are largely socially constructed, despite the fact that we know that time is passing and our bodies are physically changing during that time. When we talk about the role of industrialization, when we talked about societal transformation and how societies moved and changed over time, one of the notes we made was that when a large portion of the world, or specifically the United States, industrialized, one of the advantages to industrialization is a general rise in standards of living. So as America became an industrial society, many of the benefits of those things that industrialization brought on, but most specifically huge advances in medicine and types of surgery and just generalized better, healthier conditions such as sanitation, refrigeration, vaccinations, all these other kind of things contributed to longer lifespans. There is a chart in your text that lays out what the average lifespan was for males and females over the past 100 years. And when we look at what was considered elderly, even 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, elderly was people in their 40s and 50s, with an average lifespan now of approximately 79 years for women, about 74, I believe, for men. We can clearly see we've almost doubled the human lifespan in a little over 100 years. And when we look at the statistics over history, and we recognize that nearly 2/3, so 66%, of all the people who have ever existed in the world and throughout history who lived past the age of 50 are alive today. That's a pretty astounding statistic, but it lets us know that industrialization has had a huge effect on our attitudes just simply by not only contributing to longer lifespans, but as our populations have increased and people are living longer, clearly that's going to result in more elderly people being alive in any specific time in history than at any other time before. And a lot of these characteristics put together, especially within our own society, contribute to a phenomenon we call the graying of America. This is to say that as life expectancy increases, the population, the percentage of the population that is elderly is on the rise. So America is, and again, graying of course refers to hair color. So when we talk about the graying of America, what we're basically saying is a larger percentage of our population is elderly, and that is probably only going to increase over time. So if we want to take a look at this again from the major sociological perspectives, we can take a look at it first from symbolic interactionism. So we want to take a look at what some of the symbols surrounding this phenomena are, and clearly just the idea of age and specifically what it is to be elderly could be considered symbols. Just the fact that industrialization, again, has contributed not only to longer lifespans, but more elderly people being around, we can take a look at some of the, when we look at history and people's attitudes about the symbol of age or being elderly, we can clearly see that it's changed. Industrialization, to a large degree, has kind of removed somewhat of the uniqueness of being elderly, where we might say 200 years ago, a person who was in their 60s, who might be the oldest person in a particular town, village, whatever, would be looked at rather uniquely. When most people only lived until their 40s or 50s, if you made it to 60 or 70 years old, that was pretty special. Now, clearly, we look around our society and the uniqueness of being that old is certainly gone, and that's going to change some of our symbols or our interpretations of those symbols in our society. Certainly, we can look at, as our society became more and more industrialized and people are largely more and more educated, it kind of removes the idea of elderly people or older people being more wise. Clearly, we used to look at elderly people as having a lot of knowledge, whereas especially now that we've talked about the rapid industrialization and how often our society's technology changes, whereas we may have looked at 200 years ago, an elderly person is having a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom. They were somebody you might go to for explanations or advice. Nowadays, and this couples with the third point, that with our society's rapid changes in technology and advancement, along with a very strong emphasis on productivity, getting stuff done, being accomplished, and contributing to society, we often regard elderly people as not being able to contribute to such a high degree, and because technology is often very new to them, we kind of remove that idea of elderly people as being especially gifted or wise or knowledgeable, because again, I've challenged some of my students, if you've ever had to perhaps teach your grandmother to send an email, or your grandfather to work a satellite TV remote, sometimes we can be easily frustrated by the fact that they can't seem to do the things that we prize in society, and that's simply because society's changed and changes our attitudes about elderly. So we've gotten to a point where we look at things from a symbolic interactionist view, where age and being elderly is in a lot of ways become more of a liability than an asset, and certainly that's going to change people's attitudes and perceptions of the idea of being elderly. From a functional point of view, again, the idea that society is a living organism with all the parts working together. Functionalists look at the changes going on in society by this graying of America as largely being structural changes. So yes, there are more and more elderly in our society, but that society then will adapt to meet those changes. And if you're looking at it from a purely functional point of view, we can say now that people are retiring at an earlier age, but living longer past the age of retirement. What will these people do? Well, we've clearly seen that there's been a change in the workplace. So many more elderly, even if they leave their primary jobs or the careers that they've had for decades since being adults, that they continue to remain in the workforce. So we see a lot of elderly continuing to work in service industry, let's say fast food, or as greeters at large stores, or delivering newspapers, or doing other types of activities, which keeps them in the workforce. And then functionalists would also talk about the idea that as America ages, and we see this movement toward a higher population of elderly people, that'll open up new industries. So we see an increase in the number of retirement homes and nursing homes and insurance to cover the costs of older people, and medical practices which specialize in geriatrics, and more people getting trained in colleges to become health and home care workers the specifications of dealing with an older population. So again, for functionalists, this is going to cause structural changes in society, but then society will adapt to those changes. From a conflict theory point of view, once again, conflict theory talking about the competition that goes on between groups in society, perhaps this is more of a dark way of looking at it, but clearly we know as society gets older, that the older cohorts, the elderly, will and have to a certain degree already formed coalitions that are competing for resources, and clearly we look at the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, as being a very powerful government lobby, which is positioning itself to and lobbies on behalf of elderly people to compete for resources in society. So what are some of those resources? Well, we talk about especially Social Security. Social Security is a program set up, obviously, to pay dividends to people who have worked their entire lives and paid into Social Security that they then collect after retirement as a way of maintaining an income. Well, at one time in society when Social Security was established, many more people were paying into the system than were receiving benefits, or in other words, taking out. That ratio has become much less. To this day, there are many fewer people paying into Social Security than did, and many more people withdrawing. And when we look at population statistics and we look at this continuing graying of America, we can look at the idea that at some time in the future, the predictable future, that ratio will quickly approach 1-to-1, whereas many people are taking out of the system who are paying into it. And clearly that's not going to be sustainable. So that sets up these groups toward competing. Clearly people who are approaching the age of retirement, who have been paying into Social Security their entire lives, are going to be very vested into getting that money back or continuing to have a program that takes out. But of course that's going to require more input by the people who are working now, who probably wonder about whether or not that program will even exist and why are they paying into it now if in some time in the future they might not be able to draw from that program. Another thing we could look at is as more and more and more resources are again now going toward maintaining and benefiting the elderly, that necessarily is taking more and more resources away from young people in our society. And when we look at the number of children living in poverty in our society, we recognize that number is going up, and we would say, okay, we need to funnel more of our society's resources into benefiting children, then that money necessarily could be seen as being taken away from the elderly in our society. So these two groups will position themselves for competition, which again is the crux of conflict theory. So again, conflict theory says that the situation is being set up and already has set itself up for there to be these intergenerational conflicts, which are probably only going to intensify